then I hand over to Sally, who will present on, I think, mesopelagic fishery in the California current.
Yes, awesome.
Beautiful.
Okay, let me show my screen.
Yeah.
Can everyone see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. Hi all, my name is Sally Dowd, and I'm going to be talking about the economic trade-offs and ecological implications of a potential mesopelagic zone fishery in the California current. Big thank you to my collaborators, Millie Chapman, Laura Cohen, Porter Hoagland, and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution for funding, and UC Berkeley's CNR Honors Program for support. So I'm not going to give too much background on the mesopelagic zone here, but I would like to highlight that there are clear ecological connections between surface waters and the mesopelagic zone. So predators such as sharks, whales, swordfish, and birds consume mesopelagic fishes. And this presentation is going to focus on commercially and non-commercially valuable predators of mesopelagic fish in the California current. So this two-part study has both bioeconomic and ecological models that use data from a California current food web model from Cohen et al. 2016. This mass balance model was made with EcoPath with EcoSim, EWE, with its spatial domain shown in Figure 1. Within EWE, users can organize species into distinct biomass pools or functional groups and input parameters that describe relationships within and between these groups. Mesopelagic fish is one functional group in this model, and it's comprised mainly of myctophids or lanternfish. The complex food web model for our model is shown in Figure 2, and it has both mesopelagic prey and predators highlighted. One of the few regulations on harvesting the mesopelagic zone is a moratorium established by the Pacific Fisheries Management Council on the harvest of certain mesopelagic fish families off of the US West Coast. Though fishers from several countries have harvested this zone in the past with little evidence of commercial success, growing interest to utilize mesopelagic fishes as fish meal makes the question of whether or not to harvest this zone relevant again. So we chose this California current food web model as a base for the study to look at both the economic and ecological importance of this moratorium. So for part 1, we adopted a bioeconomic model originally designed for the Pacific sardine fishery to examine the trade-offs between harvesting mesopelagic fishes on one hand and leaving them in the water for forage for their predators on the other. So the idea behind this is that the decision to harvest mesopelagic fishes depends on the hypothetical economic value gained from the fishery when compared to altered values associated with predators after one of their prey sources has been depleted. So the main equation we use is up on your screen. And on the left side of the inequality, there's the potential price of mesopelagic fish as fish meal in the market. And then on the right side, you have the forage value of mesopelagic fish. So the forage value includes both non-commercial and commercial value, which incorporates landing prices, biological data from the food web model, and a critical value. Sorry, my click is not going well. So the mu, or the critical value, is the value that's required to equate the left and right side. The critical value can be conceptualized as the hypothetical non-market value of predators and mesopelagic fishes. So we inputted all of the input parameters besides the critical value, and then we calculated a baseline critical value of $16.40 per pound a year. So what does this value imply? It means that non-commercial predators need to jointly generate a value over $16.40 per pound a year to reverse the inequality in equation 1 and make mesopelagic fish more valuable left in the water as forage for their predators instead of utilized as a commercial resource. So we can actually compare this critical value to willingness to pay values. Willingness to pay values are found in environmental economic studies, and they are hypothetical monetary amounts that often estimate a species' existence value. So there were 7 species in this food web model that had documented willingness to pay values. So we converted these into a per unit value. And table 2 is showing a range of the willingness to pay per pound values, and they range widely with a mean of $36 per pound. So I've talked a lot about critical values and willingness to pay values. Now I want to relate their significance to our main question of if this moratorium off the US West Coast is justifiable from an economics perspective. So our baseline critical value of $16 per pound and the average critical values when we considered variation in input parameters of biomass, price, and fishing cost were all under the mean willingness to pay per pound calculated as shown in figure 3. So the mean value for willingness to pay per pound is shown by the dashed line there. And then the mean critical value is shown by the solid line. So for clarification, as the input parameters in equation 1 had uncertainty around them, we calculated different iterations of the critical values from varying values in natural mortality of mesopelagic fish, biomass of predators in the model, and hypothetical fishing cost, as well as the price of commercial predators. So on paper, since this critical value or the minimum value required to equate the left and right side is lower than the willingness to pay values, it would suggest that mesopelagic fish are more valuable left in the water for their prey. However, we do have to exercise caution when comparing willingness to pay values to the critical value due to the problematic nature of species existence values. One reason why these values have been questioned in the past is because they're just hypothetical. So survey respondents aren't ever going to actually have to pay this value, so they might overestimate how much they would actually pay for a species to continue to exist. That being said, these hypothetical species existence values make it difficult to draw a clear conclusion on the practicality of this moratorium, and they're also only part of the value that can be attributed to non-commercial predators. So this portion of the study calculated important critical values and looked at some variation in input parameters, but there's more work that could be done. Future work could consider more sources of non-commercial value, and it would also be beneficial to examine the potential direct loss or gain of revenue from predators of mesopelagic fish if there was a commercial fishing operation. In part 2 of this study, we used RPath and RStudio to simulate the ecosystem-wide effects of harvesting mesopelagic fishes. RPath is the R-based implementation of EcoPath with EcoSim. We decided to focus on propagating the effects for 2 harvest scenarios. Through scenario 1, we applied a 50% harvest rate, and through scenario 2, we applied a 25% harvest rate on mesopelagic fish for the years 2001 to 2015. So before I leave this page and dive into some graphs, I do want to talk about the general trends in our results. If there is one takeaway, it's that for the California current ecosystem, harvesting mesopelagic fishes does not appear to have large ecosystem-wide impacts with the methods we used. So at the end of both scenario 1 and 2, around 75% of the species in the model actually increased. This being said, most biomass changes were minor. Here's a panel figure where the first row has predators and mesopelagic fish with a high diet dependence, and the second row has those with low diet dependence. A group had high diet dependence if at least 5% of their diet was comprised of mesopelagic fishes. And there were only 12 out of 42 predators of mesopelagic fish that were in this high diet dependence category. The different columns are various mesopelagic fish harvest scenarios, and the groups are divided up by color based on their value classification. On the x-axis, you have relative biomass, which is the biomass at the end of the scenario, so 2050. Figures 3A and D show the impacts of a 25% harvest rate on mesopelagic fishes, and figures 3B and 3E are the results for the yearly 50% harvest rate. So for both harvest scenario 1 and 2, only 29 and then 77 groups out of 92 exhibited 10% or greater change in their biomass. And then when we broke the results down, commercial versus non-commercial, we see that the majority of the species increased but had small biomass changes. So why did we see these results? To get at this question, we did a deeper dive into the food web dynamics, and we took predators and mesopelagic fish in that high diet dependence category and weighted their diet proportions on mesopelagic fish and mesopelagic fish prey items based on predator biomass. So I know the groupings can get confusing, but the takeaway for figure 4 is that mesopelagic predators have a much larger dependence on mesopelagic prey items than on mesopelagic fish themselves. So to conclude, I do want to mention some differences between the bioeconomic and ecological models, as the 2 models did yield different conclusions. The bioeconomic model is static and it only incorporates bottom-up processes. Therefore, it ignores the interaction between fishing and forage fish abundance and productivity. The bioeconomic model only assumes linear relationships. So it's saying if the forage fish group, mesopelagic fish here, increase, then their predators are going to too, due to increased prey availability. Our path with RSIM uses a dynamic approach that incorporates the interactions mentioned above that the bioeconomic model ignores. So a multi-model approach is important for fisheries management, and these two models on their own could have led to overestimates or underestimates, but together they could span the range of realistic scenarios. So the results here don't imply that we should go ahead and harvest the mesopelagic zone just because the impacts on predator biomass were not that substantial for the California current. As many of you on this call know, there's so much that's unknown about the mesopelagic zone still, and the results seen in this ecosystem will not be the same for every ecosystem. So before a commercial harvesting operation is opened up, it's necessary to know more about the ecology, biology, and physical properties of the zone. So I do want to point out our path is an open source software, so the methods used in this study can serve as a framework for future studies. Here are my citations. I'll leave it up for a second as I know this is being recorded. And I also want to mention that this work is published. So if you follow the DOI on your screen, you can access it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. It was great. I have to admit, I mean, I'm into these economics. I'm not really, I mean, it's not really my field, but it's super interesting. Do you know, if we can start with the one question and then leave it and open the floor to everybody else. Do you know how much is already fished? If there's some fishery going on, or is there some trials going on, or?
There's some trials. So there's some Scandinavian countries that have been doing a bit of exploratory mesopelagic fishing. So there's not an established commercial fishing operation for the mesopelagic zone. Yet there has been in the past, but some countries are looking into it for fish meal to supply the aquaculture industry and then for nutraceuticals. Yeah,
okay, nice. All right, so how about I open it up for questions? Does anybody else have a question for the models? Eiley, I think you raised your hand.
Hi, Svenja, thank you. That was really interesting, Sally. I have a couple questions, but I'll keep it to one or two. But I was curious, I'm studying the variability in mesopelagic fish populations along the California coast, and it looks like things are really variable depending on the physical conditions along the coast, which, as you know, for an upwelling system can be quite variable unto itself. So I'm wondering, first of all, if you took into account the variability in the populations of mesopelagic fish themselves.
Yeah, great question. So not in the way that you're thinking of. I wish we did. I did have some, let me go to the slide. So Laura Cohen had 500 ecopath models that were generated through Monte Carlo. So what we did to look at input uncertainty, which includes all the parameters for mesopelagic fish, is we applied a 25% harvest rate to those models. We took them into our path. And then we looked at the biomass changes and did quantiles to see if there were huge differences in the biomass among these 500 models. And what we found was between the lower, the 2.5% and the upper 97.5% quantile, there was only on average 5% variation across the simulation. But in general, we didn't force any different environmental variables than was originally constructed in the model. But I think that'd be super interesting. And I know one's able to do that in EcoPath and RPath as well. So.
Great. And then my follow-up question, I was just curious if you considered the effects that some of these vertical migrators may have in supporting some of the deeper food webs. Because I know a lot of that carbon from the surface ends up at those depths that then become available for deeper whole communities. So, there's a whole other rationale for why these fish may be better kept in the ocean. But I'm curious if you thought about that or took that into consideration with your predators.
Yeah, so we didn't necessarily, the food web model that we used was originally designed for forage fish in the California current, not necessarily mesopelagic fish. So it was designed with higher taxonomic resolution for other forage fish. And the predators, there's not like a ton of consideration to the deep sea. Like there's some rockfish that can be a little deeper, but not in terms of the groups that you're probably thinking about. But that would be a great next step.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else has any question? Just either raise your hand or shout out. All right. Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much. I think we move on to the next speaker, and if people remember some questions later on, we can still do that.